이제 이번 세션의 마지막 발표자이신 카렌 선생님을 소개할 시간이 카렌 톰슨 선생님을 소개할 시간이 돌아왔습니다. 선생님, 톰슨 선생님.
Hello, everyone. Hi, everyone. Greetings from Los Angeles, where I'm talking to you from last night, Thursday night in LA. I'm a professor of gender and sexuality studies, English and American studies, and ethnicity at the University of Southern California, and also the chair of gender and sexuality studies.
네, 선생님이 본인을 먼저 이렇게 소개해 주셨는데요. 그럼 소개하신 부분 빼놓고 제가 선생님 오늘 사회를 위해서 먼저 읽어본 그 발표문에서 자신을 그 유색인종 퀴어 비평의 연구자로서 밝히셨습니다. 주요 저작인 Relocations, 그다음에 Why Karen Carpenter Matters와 같은 작업, 그 모든 작업들이 퀴어한 그리고 인종화된 몸들이 다양한 색으로 이루어진 그 메인스트림과 어떤 정상적 상태에 들어갔다 벗어났다 하면서 심지어는 때로는 그것을 통해조차 자신들의 길을 어떻게 찾아가는지에 대한 것이라는 그런 문장이 제게 굉장히 와닿았는데요. 저도 즐겨 들었던 그 팝송 가수 캐런 카펜터스의 캐런과 그다음에 선생님의 캐런 톰슨의 캐런의 마주침에서 선생님의 연구의 주요 방법이자 원천으로서의 경험이라고 하는 것을 이해할 수 있었습니다. 그리고 그런 개인적 경험을 여전히 그 연구와 교실로 끌어들이는 데 주저하는 저 자신, 그리고 그렇게 이런 저를 뭔가 형성해온 한국의 문화와 상황을 생각해 보게 되었습니다. 제 말이 길어졌는데요. 이제 그만 선생님의 발표를 청해 듣겠습니다. 네, 발표를 해주시기 부탁드립니다. 발표 시간은 30분입니다.
Hello, I'll just begin with the talk right now. Gender and sexuality have been at the forefront of social, cultural, and political public discourse, and increasingly so in the last decade. Thus, finding informed commentators, contributors, and makers in the academy and the public sector has become a priority across our media spheres, from the New York Times' recent search for a gender editor to generate and manage vertical content with nuanced points of view about gender, race, and sexuality. And for this position, Jessica Bennett was hired in 2017. To online platforms like Reductress, Jezebel, and other sites devoted to producing spreadable media with sometimes satirical and humorous feminist perspectives on culture and politics. Old media and creative arts industries have also seen an uptick in women-helmed productions and personnel, from television to film, journalism, criticism, food cultures, fashion, publishing, the public arts, and humanities, and of course, in political campaigns as well. Meanwhile, some pressing questions remain. One moment here. Oops. What shape will popular feminism take in culture and politics, and what role will feminist and LGBTQ+ politics continue to play in changing political and cultural ecosystems? How are feminist ideas interpolated by mainstream scholarly, political, and creative institutions? And what can we do to influence positively the dissemination of feminist and LGBTQ+ ideas and cultures in a broader public sphere? Women, gender, and sexuality studies programs have been at a crossroads at the same time we've been at the crosshairs of contemporary political and cultural discourse. The trope of the gender studies professor is one that's been weaponized in memes by the radical right and would-be fascists of the recently deposed Trump regime in the United States. At the same time, women, gender, and sexuality studies professors, programs, and departments have also been a font of creative projection and imagination for new generations of young people. And these are responses to that meme that you saw me post just a minute ago. Of course, such spreadable circulation of feminist concepts is limited to not limited to matinee idols, and certainly extend to figures like Audre Lorde and Angela Davis, among others who I will be discussing later. And here are some of the other responses, a kind of feminist cultural studies memes, and of course, memes turned out of the work of Audre Lorde and Angela Davis themselves. What women, gender, and sexuality studies, henceforth WGSS professors, have done in our critical practice has seeped into public discourse and practice, i.e., we take normative images and frameworks disseminated through the mainstream and make quick, creative work out of transforming them to show their complicity with normative regimes and ideologies. Indeed, the feminist Ryan Gosling Tumblr blog that you saw in the previous slide was launched by writer Danielle Henderson on October 8th, 2011, featuring, quote, feminist theory flashcards from your favorite sensitive movie dude turned meme. According to the blogger's FAQ page, Henderson started the Tumblr as a humorous way to keep track of the feminism and gender studies theorists she was studying at the University of Wisconsin. I'm not saying that we need to make memes, though I certainly wouldn't discourage people from doing so, but I do want to point out that as a field, women and gender and sexuality studies circulates in a particular way throughout the public sphere that certain other disciplines simply don't, nor are they as vilified or lionized in the process. Furthermore, in taking Henderson's example, one of our greatest charges is to find ways to harness that collective creative energy in the popular domain and to learn how to provide the institutional support and core intersectional training, a robust training in feminist, women of color, and queer trans of color studies that will continue to bear an impact not only in academia, but also in the public sphere, in public health, and in social justice organizations and movements. Among the most common debates to come up in WGSS courses, as well as when we think about how to configure WGSS departments, grow majors, and tap into a cultural zeitgeist and an obvious need for work like this in the world, is a conflict between the version of feminism and LGBT studies that many young people have autodidactically gleaned from various media spheres to the actual history, content, and research from within the fields that constitute women, gender, and sexuality studies. This is why one of the most effective models I've found in my own teaching and organizationally in my own department starts with media and communication, then works its way genealogically through the other disciplines to show how topics in circulation in contemporary discourse were debated, forged, acted as crises points within, or revolutionized and reformed various established disciplines and discourses. In the tradition of scholars and public intellectuals like Bell Hooks, Jacqueline Alexander, Angela McRobbie, Catherine Rothenberg, and Adrienne Marie Brown, Sarah Benet Weiser examines the current social, cultural, and economic conditions in the US that give rise to both popular feminism and misogyny. Thus, my own approach to the discipline of WGSS, to institutions and to courses also involves and requires experience in its multifaceted forms. It means focusing on experience gained from existing knowledges in the fields that coalesced into WGSS, as well as the task of generating experience within and beyond the boundaries of the classroom. This extends to styles of pedagogy, as well as styles of writing and presenting our research. I want to turn now to how specifically this bears itself out in my research and writing. And I do so in order to model the intellectual and procedural transparency that I believe is necessary, a complete and utter transparency about my irreverent and interdisciplinary approach to research and intellectual life that is tantamount. Guided by popular and public culture, as well as by what the activist and sci-fi scholar Adrienne Marie Brown has called pleasure activism, which I discussed in my conclusion, I hope to show how communicability and range are key to any successful collaboration from the interpersonal to the interdepartmental level, and especially to worlds beyond the institution. The broader constituencies and local communities that brought together comprise our sense of gender and sexuality studies. There are many places we could begin within the structures of institutional learning and the recognizable disciplines at the heart of my formal training, which was in English. And yet, listening to popular music, indeed singing along since I was a kid, in a matter we most commonly recognize through the trope of karaoke, but that happens in so many different ways, offers a template for what evolved into my own comparative practices of scholarship, one that reads askew, that enters in unexpected ways into the objects of our everyday lives. In the introduction to my first book, Relocations, Queer Suburban Imaginaries, I go so far as to argue that, like a good karaoke singer or American Idol singer, and no good paired with either of those does not equal an oxymoron, I've tried to make the queer suburban aesthetics I write about my own, not by singing closely to the melody in an effort to get every note right, but with an interpretive turn of phrase, an improvisation, or unexpected caesura that rearranges the stakes of each theory, each artifact of history, each transient performance. This is the ethos that continues to guide my work today. My area of focus in contemporary queer of color cultural studies tracks the complex crossings and transnational movements of cultural texts and between historical events, as well as via technologies of dissemination like the printed book, the radio, the television, or the karaoke machine. Now, one may ask, how did someone with such a staunch disciplinary training in English more broadly and in literary Victorianism using the new historicist method more specifically, how did that person become so associated with what we could call a cultural presentism, or at least a kind of recentism? In the intervening years since my graduate training, I've been able to rethink and reframe the value of my errant desires, the distractions inspired by the so-called detritus of cultural production. Several major projects into my career, I've come to discover that even though each book is always generated from my preceding work, the genesis for it may have only appeared as a pesky detail, foraged from a thick description, a song lyric stuck in my head as an incident or as a scrap in an archive from a lesser known place. All of this is to say that perhaps the connections between the research projects don't present themselves as obvious. Word cloud, queer suburbs, karaoke, Karen Carpenter, norm porn. And though I fancy that they're actually quite coherent, these peculiar pathways open to wider vistas of inquiry about how cultural forms, transformative ideas, and feelings resonate in multiple worlds. More precisely, my work has endeavored to show how queer and racialized bodies find their ways in, out, and sometimes even through variegated mainstreams and scenes of purported normalcy. I work within and try to disseminate in my teaching what is best described as a reparative mode, following the example of Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick and her pupil Jose Esteban Munoz, among many other thinkers within this genealogy. The reparative, as I'd like to remind us, isn't simply the aesthetic, psychic, and critical equivalent of turning a frown upside down, as so many have crassly tried to characterize it. In other words, the reparative, loosely interpreted by Sedgwick from the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein's object relations theory, isn't a term that wantonly permits the mere recuperation or reappropriation of defunct or problematic popular objects. Reparation, at least as I read Klein via Sedgwick, is cruelly optimistic because we constantly toggle between our infantile impulse to destroy an object that won't give and our best efforts to carefully rebuild and reconstitute it as if it may or as if it does. In my mind, reparative reading is best, or at least better, understood through the disidentificatory practice of reading an encounter that takes something threatening, forebodingly unavailable, lost, and reconstitute it in a way that eventually yields to our desires, even if that only happens phantasmatically. Meanwhile, to disidentify, as I like to simplify its definition from Munoz's landmark queer of color scholarship, means to understand the complex and sometimes contradictory nature of things that are either too closely aligned with what people expect from us or supposedly too far beyond our ken and therefore distinctly not for us. This approach to analysis, a deep reckoning with the cultural objects we are expected to either embrace or disavow because of our gendered, racialized, and sexualized positionalities, has become the bread and butter of my academic career. There is no better way to explain my second, more recently published book about my namesake, Karen Carpenter, a figure who is essentially everything I am not, than to admit outright that it is an extended exercise in and performance of disidentification and reparation. This book that I heard as part of my introduction is, in Miss Justin Vivian Vaughn's words, a tale of two Karens. It functions as a mixed memoir, interweaving my family's own stories of musicianship and trans-Pacific migration with Karen Carpenter's, in order to reflect on how we find or fail to find ways to fit in amidst our multiple displacements. Indeed, the book strives to defamiliarize our assimilated immigrant selves from ourselves through staged disidentificatory encounters with emblematically white figures like Karen Carpenter, perhaps the original Karen. And in turn, these gestures of what I call remote intimacy with other isolated voices and figures across space and time becomes a training ground for our efforts to forge other coalitions and craft new queer of color worlds into being, despite or maybe even because of our asynchrony. As I turn now to a deeper discussion of errantry as method and other resonant methodologies in my current and future work, I want once again to establish our entry points askew, our pathways through waywardness, digression, and the compulsion to insinuate oneself into the scene of production. This set of gestures of errantry insinuation, or what Attali called -1, is at the core of the scholarly approach I advocate in all of my projects, both for and also beyond academia. Saidiya Hartman's description of her own method in her crossover book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments from 2019, focuses on a stylistic practice of close narration, which she describes as placing, quote, the voice of the narrator and character in inseparable relation so that the vision, language, and rhythms of the wayward shape and arrange the text. In her own narration, she inhabits the personae of the figures in the book, fills in the gaps, scents, smells, colors, and feelings, either palimpsestic or elided by police records, medical records, and the pathological framings of archives of people of color and queer people. By character, Hartman doesn't merely refer to literary personages, either fictive or historical, but rather to the subjects of history whose stories, points of view, and errant lives were deemed unworthy of further elaboration, of the very act of narration itself that would encode them into what is archived as history. I echo her words here because I see my work, as well as I hope the work before all of us, is deeply immersed in the practices of errantry she describes and enacts in Wayward Lives. An errantry as subject, as well as style and method. I also see it as a fascinating and generative template for how we characterize the interdiscipline of women, gender, and sexuality studies. For what comprises the work of women, gender, and sexuality studies, but the difficult, tenacious labor of lovingly collating what has been discarded and scattered as minor, incidental, ordinary, estraying from other legitimized fields that more often than not cohered precisely through our sifting out and exclusion. It has taken a set of practices by queer of color scholars, writers, and activists to create the conditions of possibility, not only for the writing and scholarship that we do, but for the worlds that we have so boldly forged from this work that limits the boundaries of deep archival labor, participant or observation, and yes, even fabulation, a potent toolkit of what we might concisely describe as mixed methods. In Afrofabulations, the queer drama of Black life, Tavia Nyong'o takes up the Filipino-American anthropologist Martin Manalansan's use of the term fabulosity to argue that queer studies always finds its theory in low places. It is a sentiment I cannot identify with more, especially given the debased cultural materials my work is known for engaging, from the suburbs to 70s easy listening to karaoke and primetime dramedies. Furthermore, Nyong'o and Manalansan argue that fabulosity itself is, quote, too easily dismissed as a manic identification with lifestyles of a wealthy white elite. Instead, as Nyong'o underscores, Manalansan's ethnographies of queer life in the Filipino diaspora demonstrate how fabulosity can serve as a form of undocumented queer of color world making. The double entendre of undocumented here rings especially true when we come to understand that those of us who don't have legal papers and have therefore existed in fugitivity vis-a-vis the nation and the state across their many manifestations of historical violence are the same constituencies whose lives and stories have never been committed to paper or deemed worthy of the record. That is, until now, in the conjuring increasingly taken up by queer of color feminist scholarship, not simply to fill the gaps, but rather to raise the spirits and welcome them through these portals. When I signal the now, I don't merely refer to the present tense, recent years, or even the last 2 decades of feminist scholarship on race, gender, and sexuality, but a sense of urgency that's repeated itself and arisen at flashpoints at various moments in the literary, cultural, and scholarly landscape. I'm thinking in particular of the term biomythography, a concept that has flowed in and out of a queer of color feminist consciousness, as well as in and out of scholarly favor since its incipience in the great Audre Lorde's Zami, A New Spelling of My Name in 1982. As many of you know, the term encapsulates Lorde's efforts to capture elements of history, biography, and myth in her work. To understand why there is at once a deep fascination, as well as a knee-jerk aversion to this word, and consequently towards queer of color feminist writing in general, one need only turn to Rosemary Daniels' New York Times review of Zami from December 1982, in which she describes Lorde's generic offering as, quote, a bit pretentious. Indeed, queer criticism and writing more generally has been accused of navel-gazing and pretension. Think of Eve Sedgwick's play on that with her volume titled Novel-Gazing, since at least the late 19th century, when Oscar Wilde's autobiographical writings were used against him in his trial for gross indecency. The attention we pay to ourselves, in other words, is easily construed as self-interested and solipsistic at best, dangerous and perverse, apolitical, and even politically explosive at worst. And for people of color, queers of color, and queer women of color in particular, the notion of a self, one with a capacity to extend beyond a singularity to a multitude, to a whole community of outsiders, for whom a real place name like Kariakou assumes a status beyond the real, as a horizon for women who work together as friends and lovers, in Lorde's words. This is the kind of self most feared by the gatekeepers of so-called professionalism. Historically, universities have guarded themselves against the incursions of so many messy selves, like Audre Lorde, who, still pungent from the garlic, onions, and celery leaves her mother works in her mortal and pestle, forges theories in much the same way, threatening to confound Enlightenment models for how to quantify the idea of excellence. As Lorde writes, to encourage excellence is to go beyond the encouraged mediocrity of society. But giving in to the fear of feeling and working to capacity is a luxury only the unintentional can afford. The principal horror of any system which defines the good in terms of profit rather than in terms of human need, or which defines human need to the exclusion of the psychic and emotional components of that need, is that it robs our work of its erotic value. Such a system reduces work to a travesty of necessities, a duty by which we earn bread or oblivion for ourselves and those we love. As those trained in WGSS know, for Lord, the term erotic stems from the Hellenistic origins of eros as the, quote, personification of love in all its aspects. It applies in Lord's work specifically to the life force and, quote, creative energy of women versus ways of thinking that reduce the spiritual world to a flattened affect and are beholden to a certain ascesis or asceticism. I've always joked that the open secret of academia, one shrouded in shame despite its relative obviousness, is that to a very powerful extent, many of us work on subjects, objects, and matters of justice that we care deeply about. Dare I say, love, even if our love for what we work on is the bond that dare not speak its name. What is probably deeply apparent at this point as I wind towards my conclusion is that my approach to research and to writing for public and scholarly audiences veers towards love in a way that necessitates breaking the proverbial fourth wall. Indeed, one might say it aspires to the condition of Lordian biomythography, when it makes a concerted effort not only to document, but to sing queer of color worlds into being. And yes, I realize phrases about singing worlds into being, like starting a talk with a scene of karaoke, may seem a bit corny, like an embarrassing involuntary flash of jazz hands, when standing at attention might seem safer or more becoming in this particular setting. But I want you to stop and think about where your potential aversion to this exuberance, to this referential style and this set of methods from beyond the university's walls comes from. Is it a fear that stems from the insistence that what is popular, what is accessible to the multitude is not worth as much because it's too easily won? Is it our prevailing sense that what is hard to comprehend must necessarily be better, smarter, more revolutionary? Do we overvalue the theoretical, historical, or archival flex over the capacity to share that information through story and narrative? Do we have a preference for obfuscation over communication? Is that our curtain in the land of Oz? Do we fear that what we can grasp, indeed what we can feel, is somehow wrong? I alluded in the beginning of my talk to Adrienne Marie Brown's book, Pleasure Activism, a follow-up to Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change and Changing Worlds. Her books exist at the intersections of public discourse, activism, what I call speculative scholarship, and even self-help. It's forged from a body of Black feminist thought and writing, particularly about pleasure. As Sarah Kessler explains in her review of the book In Theory and Event, pleasure activism is rigorously sumptuous. Unlike so many academic monographs, perhaps because it isn't one, Brown's volume doesn't regurgitate and or refute the arguments of its predecessors and peers in a singular authorial voice. Instead, the book models a fractal constellation of theories and praxes of pleasure. Not one voice, but many. Not a single star, but a constellation. And definitions of concepts rather than the evasion of them or the hoarding of good ideas for oneself, as you might have noted from my own style of presentation here today. I hope to have given you a few takeaways for some of the key terms and concepts collectively forged by feminist writers and thinkers of color that have animated my research. And for good measure, here's one last key concept. This is how Brown defines pleasure activism. Pleasure activism is the work we do to reclaim our whole, happy, and satisfiable selves from the impacts, delusions, and limitations of oppression and or supremacy. In this moment, we must prioritize the pleasure of those most impacted by oppression. By necessity, women, gender, and sexuality programs, so hard won as each and every one of them has been across the US and the world, were built not only to provide an institutional container for an interdisciplinary set of inquiries centering women and sexual minorities, They were all also expected from the very outset to build worlds, as I've been talking about today, to provide spaces that would not only give our students and ourselves respite and refuge from what Brown calls the limitations of oppression and supremacy, but also a site from which to imagine, organize, and collaborate. To imagine beyond the epistemologies that would forever relegate our pleasures, our intellects, our sense of justice to the sidelines. And yet, in so many contemporary academic institutions, replete with the corporatized language of branding and the more familiar and sustained demands for austerity, WGSS departments have been asked to sustain the worlds we built with very little, sometimes with nothing, probably because our labor is sourced from what we love, and probably because that love propels us with even more determination and commitment towards an arc of justice and equality, attributes that are too easily devalued in a utilitarian metric. What I've learned from approaching my research slightly askew, with an errantry and waywardness that offered paths I might not have otherwise seen, is that the task before us as scholars and collaborators, not just within WGSS departments, though we are certainly on the front lines, is to move beyond the vitriol from both internecine and external forces as our motivation. We have to understand that the task at hand is an old one. It's something that many WGSS departments already accomplished, but that we've forgotten because we've been atomized, severed, quantified as individuals with our work set against each other in a competitive metric. Let us continue to build worlds together, not just programs and departments. Let us not continue eroding our collective values to prioritize individuals, but recognize that any intellectual and institutional leadership will need to be a part of this ecosystem, an agent of regeneration. And dare I say, we must be pleasure activists, not simply a conduit for orders that may come from above. What I hope my talk has communicated to you is how research methods spawned in the most personal and local places, born of the most incidental details from a place of feeling, has a reach, purpose, resonance, and impact that is broad, expansive, communal, and enduring in its transformative energies. I hope to continue this work at the highest level in collaboration with all of you as colleagues and interlocutors, and with our students who seek reassurance that what they do and how they do it bears the potential to reflect, challenge, and even change our worlds within and beyond the Academy. Thank you.